Beneath a ruined department store, a freshly promoted field marshal faced a final order from Berlin. Take your own life before the Red Army drags you out. Soviet soldiers discovered Friedrich Paulus huddled with his exhausted staff, his face hollow and crusted with days of stubble. Hitler had just awarded him the Field Marshal's baton by radio, a deliberate message that no German officer of that rank had ever surrendered alive. Paulus looked at the pistol beside him and refused. Over the following 48 hours, 22 of his fellow generals joined him in captivity. Most would never breathe German air again. By late January 1943, Hitler's Sixth Army was collapsing from within. Soviet Operation Uranus had snapped the trap shut back in November, and for months the encircled Germans had watched their supplies evaporate. Rations shrank to scraps. Frostbite claimed thousands. Bombs fell day and night without mercy. The Luftwaffe's promise of an aerial lifeline proved hollow from the start. Transport planes couldn't carry enough food, fuel, or ammunition for over 200,000 starving men. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's desperate rescue mission, codenamed Winterstorm, had frozen in its tracks 30 miles short of the pocket the previous December. Inside Stalingrad's rubble, wounded soldiers packed every basement and cellar while ammunition chests sat nearly empty. Small groups of men began wandering towards Soviet lines, hands raised. What happened next would shatter a Prussian tradition centuries old. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal via radio transmission. No German or Prussian officer holding that rank had ever been taken prisoner. The implication was crystal clear. Paulus reportedly told a colleague he had no desire to do Berlin any such favor. The next morning, Soviet troops kicked open the door to that department store basement where Paulus and his command staff had made their last stand. Major Anatoly Soldatov, one of the first Red Army officers through the entrance, later described conditions inside as beyond filthy: excrement, blood, and rotting food everywhere. Paulus surrendered his southern sector without any formal written order. 2 days later, on February 2nd, General Karl Strecker finally gave up the last northern holdout near the Barricady gun factory. The deadliest battle in history was finished. Why would Hitler promote a man he clearly expected to die? In the chaos that followed, Soviet troops began sorting their prisoners. Officers and generals were pulled from the common soldiers and placed under heavy guard. Paulus, along with his Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Arthur Schmidt and Adjutant Colonel Wilhelm Adam, was driven away from the burning city under armed escort. The remaining rank and file, approximately 91,000 men, began the infamous death march to prisoner camps scattered across the Soviet Union. Most were already half dead, starving, frostbitten, and crawling with disease. Columns of ragged ghosts stretched for miles across the frozen steppe, guarded by Soviets who showed zero sympathy for their suffering. The first months of captivity became a slaughter. Disease rampaged through overcrowded transit camps where men slept on frozen ground without blankets, shelter, or medicine. Those who survived the initial weeks got shipped to labor camps in Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia, where misery persisted for years. Of all the soldiers captured at Stalingrad, roughly 6,000 would ever see Germany again. But the generals, held separately and treated as political trophies, walked a very different road. What happened when the Soviets decided to weaponize these captive commanders? By mid-1943, the captured generals had been relocated to a special installation. Camp number 48 at Voykovo, near Ivanovo, about 300 kilometers northeast of Moscow. The facility occupied an old sanatorium and earned the nickname the Castle, because its conditions were luxurious compared to ordinary POW hellholes. Paulus, Schmidt, and over 20 senior officers lived there under constant NKVD surveillance. Agents pretending to be interpreters and servants monitored every conversation and reported back to Moscow's intelligence chiefs. The Soviets saw these men not merely as prisoners but as propaganda weapons waiting to be aimed at Berlin. On July 12, 1943, Moscow established the National Committee for a Free Germany, NKFD, in Krasnogorsk near Moscow. Run by German communist exiles and carefully selected POWs, the committee's official mission was encouraging Hitler's overthrow and demanding an end to the war. Its real function? Producing propaganda designed to shatter Wehrmacht morale. 2 months later, in September 1943, a more focused organization emerged, the League of German Officers, or BDO. Its chairman was General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had commanded the LI Army Corps at Stalingrad. Seydlitz had openly defied Paulus during the battle's final days, giving his subordinate officers permission to surrender on their own. Paulus had relieved him of command for that insubordination. What did the Soviets want Seydlitz to do with his fellow prisoners? Under Moscow's supervision, the BDO cranked out radio broadcasts, leaflets, and written appeals urging German soldiers to desert. Seydlitz went even further, proposing a 40,000-strong army of German prisoners who would fight alongside the Red Army and get airlifted into Germany to spark an uprising. Moscow never approved the scheme, but the mere suggestion terrified Nazi leadership. Back in Germany, the phrase Seydlitz troops became shorthand for traitors operating behind enemy lines. Hitler's government sentenced Seydlitz to death in absentia in April 1944 and placed his family under Sippenhaft, collective detention for relatives of accused turncoats. Paulus, however, initially refused all cooperation. For over a year, he insisted his loyalty remained with Germany, despite relentless pressure from Soviet handlers. The turning point came after July 20, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's assassination attempt on Hitler failed spectacularly. The execution of officers Paulus had personally known, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, shattered whatever resolve he had left. On August 8, 1944, Paulus went on Free Germany radio with a message for German soldiers. For Germany, the war is lost, he declared. Germany must renounce Hitler. In retaliation, the Nazi regime placed his wife Elena and his daughter under Sippenhaft. The field marshal, who had once followed every order from Berlin, had finally turned his back on the regime entirely. What happened when this turncoat general faced his former comrades in court? On February 11, 1946, the Nuremberg courtroom fell silent. For months, defense attorneys for Nazi leaders had dismissed Paulus's earlier written testimony as Soviet-forged fiction. They demanded he appear in person, confident Moscow would never release such a prized captive. When presiding Judge Jeffrey Lawrence asked Soviet Chief Prosecutor Roman Rudenko how long bringing the witness to Nuremberg would take, Rudenko calmly replied, "About 30 minutes." Paulus was already sitting in the Soviet delegation's residence, just outside the courthouse. The Soviets had smuggled him across occupied Germany using a decoy convoy with a double in a second car to foil any assassination attempts. His appearance caused an absolute sensation. Paulus testified that planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union had begun as early as September 1940, while he served as deputy chief of the General Staff. He described the operational drafts he'd worked on in detail and confirmed that senior leaders including Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl had been directly involved in preparing Operation Barbarossa. His testimony helped convict both men, who were later executed. For the defendants sitting across the courtroom, many of whom had last seen Paulus as a loyal field commander, the moment was devastating. After the trial, Paulus returned to Soviet custody, though under much improved conditions. He lived in a guarded villa outside Moscow, receiving better food and limited freedom. Meanwhile, the other Stalingrad generals faced wildly different outcomes. Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, refused every Soviet attempt at cooperation. When interrogators offered better conditions in exchange for statements against the regime, Schmidt reportedly told them he'd rather rot in prison than break his oath. He held that line for 12 years, until his release in 1955. General Oberst Walter Heitz, who had ordered his men to fight to the last bullet, died in Soviet captivity on February 9, 1944, barely a year after being taken prisoner. Captivity lasted longer than the war itself for the men who walked out of Stalingrad. Other generals who cooperated with the NKFD went on to build the new East German state. Otto Korfs, who had commanded the 295th Infantry Division at Stalingrad and was among the first senior officers to join the committee, took charge of military archives at the East German Interior Ministry after his release in 1948. By 1952, he held the rank of Major General in the Kaserniert Volkspolizei, the armed police force that preceded East Germany's National Army. Arno von Lenski, who had led the 24th Panzer Division, followed a similar path and helped build East Germany's armored forces. Others returned to a West Germany that wanted nothing to do with men who had broadcast Soviet appeals. Collaboration versus loyalty would shadow these generals for the rest of their lives, splitting families and former comrades along Cold War fault lines. 22 generals entered captivity. Most of their soldiers never left it. In 1953, 2 years before the last ordinary prisoners returned, Paulus was released from Soviet custody and allowed to move to Dresden in East Germany. He took a position as civilian chief of the East German Military History Research Institute, a quiet role that kept him close to the regime but out of public view. He lived modestly, gave occasional lectures to military audiences, and avoided the spotlight. His wife Elena had died in 1949 in Baden-Baden, West Germany, without ever seeing him again. Their son Friedrich had been lost in action at Anzio, Italy, in February 1944. The family Paulus returned to no longer existed. Seidlitz's path proved even harder. Despite years of active cooperation with the Soviets, a Soviet military tribunal sentenced him to death in July 1950 on charges of war crimes committed during his earlier Wehrmacht service. The sentence was commuted within hours to 25 years of imprisonment. He served 5 of those years before a diplomatic breakthrough changed his fate. In September 1955, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow and negotiated the release of the last approximately 10,000 German prisoners of war still held in the Soviet Union. The event entered history as the Heimkehr der 10.000, the return of the 10,000. Seidlitz was among those released in October. On October 7, 1955, the first 600 former prisoners arrived at the Friedland transit camp near Göttingen. Crowds lined the roads as families who had waited a decade searched the faces of hollow-eyed, aging men they barely recognized. In exchange for the prisoners' release, West Germany agreed to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Germans regarded Adenauer's achievement as the defining moment of his chancellorship. Seidlitz returned to a country that rejected him. Former comrades called him a traitor, and the Bundeswehr denied him military honors. His Nazi-era death sentence was overturned in 1956, but the stigma remained. He settled quietly in Bremen and lived in near-total obscurity until his death on April 28, 1976, at the age of 87. Russia posthumously pardoned him in 1996. Paulus died in Dresden on February 1, 1957, exactly 14 years after his surrender at Stalingrad. His body was taken across the border to Baden-Baden and buried beside his wife. Karl Rodenberg, who had commanded the 76th Infantry Division, outlived them all. He died in 1992 at the age of 98, the last of the Stalingrad generals. Of the roughly 91,000 men who had surrendered with Paulus, only some 6,000 ever made that journey home. The generals had survived. Most of their soldiers had not. 22 generals walked out of a frozen city and into a captivity that lasted longer than the war itself. Their fates were shaped by the same forces that defined post-war Europe: ideology, survival, and the long shadow of choices made under impossible pressure. If this story gripped you, watch our next video on what became of the Waffen-SS after World War II. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep history from War Real History.